James Whitaker sat alone in his father's old wooden chair, staring at the papers spread across the table. The numbers were bad, very bad. He owed money to almost every merchant in town, and the bank was threatening to take his ranch away. The winter had been cruel. A terrible snowstorm had killed most of his cattle. Without cattle to sell, James had no money to pay his debts. He was running out of time. The creditors gave him 3 months to pay everything he owed. If he failed, he would lose the land his father and grandfather had worked so hard to build. James was 32 years old and had never married. He had always been too busy working the ranch. Now he wished he had a partner to help him through this dark time. But he was alone, completely alone. One afternoon, a stranger came to the ranch. His name was Cornelius, and he was a traveling merchant. Cornelius was a heavy man with small, dark eyes and a thick beard. He wore expensive clothes that looked out of place in the dusty ranch yard. "I heard about your troubles," Cornelius said, sitting down without being invited. Word travels fast in these parts. James didn't like the man, but he was too tired to be rude. "What do you want?" he asked. Cornelius smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "I want to help you," he said. "I have a business proposition for you." James listened as Cornelius explained his offer. The merchant had a daughter named Margaret. She was 28 years old and unmarried. Cornelius wanted to find her a husband. He was willing to pay a large sum of money to the man who would marry her. "How much?" James asked. His heart was beating fast. Cornelius named a figure. It was exactly enough to pay all of James's debts and save the ranch. James felt sick to his stomach. "Why would you pay so much?" he asked. "What's wrong with her?" Cornelius looked away. "She's a good girl," he said. "She can cook and clean. She's smart, but she's not what men usually want. She's very large, very heavy," James understood. The daughter was fat, and her father was ashamed of her. He wanted to get rid of her, and he was willing to pay for it. "I need to think about it," James said. "You have 1 week," Cornelius replied. "After that, I take my offer somewhere else." That night, James couldn't sleep. He walked around his property in the darkness, looking at the land his family had owned for 3 generations. The barn where he was born, the fields his father had plowed, the fence his grandfather had built with his own hands. He couldn't lose all of this. He just couldn't. But marrying a complete stranger, a woman her own father didn't want, it felt wrong. It felt like he was buying her. Or maybe selling himself. James thought about his options. He could try to borrow more money, but no one in town would lend to him. He could sell part of the land, but that would break his heart. He could let the bank take everything and start over somewhere new, but where would he go? What would he do? The week passed quickly. James tried to find another way, but there was no other way. On the 7th day, Cornelius returned. "What's your answer?" the merchant asked. James took a deep breath. "I'll do it," he said. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. "I'll marry your daughter." Cornelius smiled, that unpleasant smile again. "Good," he said. "The wedding will be in 2 weeks. I'll bring Margaret to town. You'll meet her at the church on the wedding day." "I don't get to meet her first?" James asked. "No need," Cornelius said. "You've agreed to the deal. She's agreed to the deal. That's all that matters." James wanted to argue. But what could he say? He had already made his choice. The 2 weeks felt like 2 days. James tried to prepare himself. He cleaned the house. He fixed the broken door on the bedroom. He bought new sheets for the bed. He didn't know what else to do. The other ranch hands noticed something was wrong. "You seem nervous, boss," one of them said. "I'm getting married," James told them. They were shocked. "Married? To who?" "You'll meet her at the wedding," James said. He couldn't explain the arrangement. It was too shameful. Finally, the wedding day arrived. James put on his best suit. It had belonged to his father, and it smelled like old wood and dust. He rode into town early in the morning, his stomach twisting with worry, at the church. A small group of people had gathered. Most of them came out of curiosity, not friendship. Everyone knew James was in trouble. Everyone wanted to see what desperate thing he would do. Cornelius was already there, standing outside the church. "She's inside," he said. "Go meet your bride." James walked into the small wooden church. His boots made loud sounds on the floor, at the front, near the altar. stood a woman in a simple white dress. This was Margaret. This was the woman he had agreed to marry. This was his future. James had made his choice. Now he would have to live with it, for better or for worse. His life was about to change forever. James walked slowly down the church aisle, his boots clicking against the wooden floor. Each step felt heavier than the last. His hands were sweating, and his collar felt too tight around his neck. The small church smelled like old books and candle wax. Margaret stood with her back to him, facing the altar. She wore a simple white dress that her father must have bought for the occasion. Her brown hair was pulled back in a tight bun from behind. James could see she was indeed a large woman. Her shoulders were broad and the dress strained against her frame. When she heard his footsteps, Margaret turned around slowly. James stopped walking. He tried not to show surprise on his face, but it was difficult. Margaret was much heavier than he had imagined. Her face was round and pale, with soft features that might have been pretty on a smaller woman. Her eyes were a light gray color, like storm clouds, and they looked terrified. She was scared, James realized. She was just as scared as he was, maybe even more scared. "Hello," James said quietly. His voice echoed in the empty church. "Hello," Margaret whispered back. She didn't look at him directly. Instead, she stared at the floor. An awkward silence filled the space between them. Neither knew what to say. They were two strangers about to promise their lives to each other. The church door opened behind them. Cornelius walked in with the priest. Behind them came a small crowd of townspeople. James recognized most of them: Mrs. Henderson from the general store, Tom Bailey, who owned the saloon, the banker Mr. Thornton, several ranch hands from neighboring properties. They had all come to watch the spectacle. James heard someone whisper, "That's her?" "Good Lord," another voice louder said. "Poor bastard must be truly desperate." Margaret heard them too. Her face turned red and her eyes filled with tears. She blinked rapidly, trying to hold them back. James felt a surge of anger. These people had no right to judge. They didn't know anything about Margaret. They didn't know anything about his situation, but he said nothing. What could he say? "Let's begin," the priest said. He was an old man named Father Mackenzie. He looked uncomfortable, as if he didn't want to be part of this arrangement. The ceremony was short and cold. There were no flowers, no music, no joy. The priest read the words quickly, rushing through the vows like he wanted to finish and leave. "Do you, James Whitaker, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Father Mackenzie asked. James looked at Margaret. She was still staring at the floor. Her hands were clasped together so tightly that her knuckles had turned white. "I do," James said. "Do you, Margaret Walsh, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" The priest continued. Margaret's voice was barely audible. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," Father Mackenzie said. "You may kiss the bride." This was the worst part. James leaned forward awkwardly. Margaret lifted her face slightly. Their lips touched for barely a second. It was not a kiss of love or even affection. It was just a requirement, a seal on a business transaction. The few people in the church clapped half-heartedly. Someone in the back laughed. It was a mean laugh, full of mockery. Cornelius stepped forward. "Congratulations," he said. But he was looking at James, not his daughter. "Now, about the payment, right there, in front of everyone, in front of his new wife." They conducted their business. Cornelius handed James a leather bag heavy with money. James counted it quickly. It was all there. Every dollar they had agreed upon. "Pleasure doing business with you," Cornelius said. Then he turned to Margaret. "Goodbye?" "Daughter?" Margaret's face showed shock. "Father? Aren't you staying for—" "No," Cornelius interrupted. "I have business in the next town. I need to leave today." "But father—" "Please," Margaret's voice cracked. "Don't leave me here with—" "You're a married woman now," Cornelius said coldly. "You belong to your husband, not to me. Be grateful someone was willing to take you." With those cruel words, Cornelius Walsh walked out of the church. He didn't hug his daughter. He didn't wish her well. He didn't even look back. Margaret stood frozen. Watching her father leave, a single tear rolled down her cheek. James felt uncomfortable witnessing her pain. He cleared his throat. "We should go," he said gently. The townspeople filed out of the church, whispering to each other. James heard fragments of their conversations. Did you see how big she is? He married her for money, obviously. Give it a month before he leaves her. I heard her own father paid to get rid of her, Mrs. Henderson stopped near them. Welcome to married life, she said to James with fake sweetness. Then she looked at Margaret. Good luck, dear. You'll need it. Her tone made it clear she meant the opposite. Outside the church, more people had gathered. Word had spread quickly about the unusual wedding. They stared openly as James and Margaret walked to his wagon. A group of young men stood near the saloon. One of them, a ranch hand named Billy, called out, Hey, Whitaker, how much did they pay you to take the fat one? His friends burst out laughing. James's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He helped Margaret climb onto the wagon. It was difficult because of her size and the dress. She struggled and people watched. Some looked away in pity. Others kept staring. Finally, Margaret was seated. James climbed up beside her and took the reins. The horses started moving, pulling them away from the church, away from the town, toward the ranch. They rode in complete silence. The only sounds were the horses' hooves on the dirt road and the creaking of the wagon wheels. James didn't know what to say. Margaret said nothing at all. After about an hour, James glanced at his new wife. She was crying silently. Tears streamed down her face, but she made no sound. She just stared straight ahead, her hands folded in her lap. James felt something twist in his chest. Was it guilt? Pity? He wasn't sure. He had thought this arrangement would solve his problems. Now he wondered if he had just created new ones. When they finally reached the ranch, the sun was setting. The old house looked small and lonely against the darkening sky. James stopped the wagon. We're here, he said. Margaret looked at the house, her new home, her prison. She wiped her tears with the back of her hand and nodded. This was their beginning. Two broken people, brought together by desperation and greed. Two strangers now bound together for life. Neither wanted to be there. Neither had chosen this. James helped Margaret down from the wagon. For a moment, they stood together in the fading light. Not as husband and wife, but as two people trapped in the same cage. I'll show you the house, James said finally. Margaret followed him inside, and with that, their strange life together began. The first night in the ranch house was the longest night of Margaret's life. James showed her the bedroom, a small room with a simple bed and a wooden dresser. The walls were bare except for one faded picture of a woman Margaret assumed was James's mother. You can sleep here, James said. Standing in the doorway, he wouldn't come inside. I'll sleep in the barn. The barn? Margaret asked, surprised. It's fine, James said quickly. I've slept there before. There's a cot in the tack room. It's comfortable enough. Margaret wanted to say something, but what could she say? Thank you for not wanting to sleep near me. She stayed silent. James left without another word. Margaret heard his boots walking away, then the front door closing, then silence. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked around her new home. Everything was plain and worn. The curtains were thin and torn in places. Dust covered most surfaces. The floor hadn't been properly swept in months, maybe years. This was her life now. This empty house with a husband who couldn't stand to sleep under the same roof. Margaret lay down fully clothed and cried herself to sleep. The next morning, she woke early. The sun was just beginning to rise. She could hear roosters crowing outside. For a moment, she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed back. Margaret got up and explored the house. The kitchen was a disaster. Dirty dishes were piled in the basin. The stove was covered in grease. Cupboards were nearly empty except for some flour, beans, and coffee. There was no organization, no system. She found James's record book on a shelf. Out of curiosity, she opened it. What she saw shocked her. The accounts were a complete mess. Numbers were written sideways, crossed out, rewritten. Income and expenses were mixed together with no clear categories. No wonder he was in debt. He had no idea what he was spending or earning. Margaret heard footsteps on the porch. She quickly closed the book and stepped away. James came in looking tired. His hair was messy, and there was straw stuck to his shirt. Good morning, Margaret said quietly. James nodded but didn't reply. He went to the kitchen and poured himself cold coffee from yesterday's pot. I could make fresh coffee, Margaret offered. This is fine, James said. Another silence fell between them. "What would you like for breakfast?" Margaret asked. "I usually just have coffee," James said. "Sometimes bread if there is any." "That's not enough food for a working man," Margaret said before she could stop herself. James looked at her with surprise. It was the first time she had spoken with any confidence. "I'll make something proper," Margaret continued, feeling bold. "If you tell me what supplies you have," James shrugged. "There's not much. Some eggs from the chicken's flour, a bit of bacon." Margaret nodded and got to work. She found the eggs, checked that they were still good, and located a frying pan within 30 minutes. She had prepared a full breakfast: fried eggs, bacon, and fresh biscuits made from the flour. James ate without speaking, but Margaret noticed he finished everything on his plate. "Thank you," he said when he was done. Then he left to work on the ranch. This became their routine. Margaret would wake early, clean the house, prepare meals, and wait. James would work from sunrise to sunset, coming in only to eat. They barely spoke beyond necessary words. "Supper is ready?" "Thank you. Do you need anything from town?" "No." Days turned into weeks. Margaret kept herself busy. She scrubbed the house from top to bottom. She organized the pantry. She mended torn curtains and worn clothes. She tended the small vegetable garden that had been neglected for years. Despite everything, Margaret was good at running a household. Back in her father's house, she had managed everything after her mother died. She knew how to stretch a dollar, how to preserve food, how to keep things running smoothly. One afternoon, she couldn't resist. She took James's account book and began reorganizing it. She created clear columns for income and expenses. She categorized everything: ranch supplies, animal feed, household goods, loan payments. She went back through 6 months of messy records and made sense of them. When James came in that evening, Margaret had the book open on the table. "What are you doing?" James asked, his voice sharp. "I reorganized your accounts," Margaret said nervously. "I hope you don't mind." "I just thought you had no right to touch my things," James said angrily. Margaret's face went red. "I'm sorry. I was just trying to help." James picked up the book and looked at it. His anger faded as he saw what she had done. Everything was neat, clear, organized for the first time. He could actually see where his money was going. "This is good work," he admitted reluctantly. "I can continue keeping the books." "If you want," Margaret offered. "I'm good with numbers." "My father taught me," James hesitated. His pride was hurt, but he wasn't stupid. Margaret clearly had skills he lacked. "Fine," he said. "You can manage the household accounts." It was a small victory for Margaret. At least now she had a purpose. At least she was useful. But the emotional distance between them remained. James still slept in the barn. They still barely talked. Margaret often felt invisible, like a servant rather than a wife. One evening, she was sitting on the porch. Watching the sunset, she didn't hear James approach. He had been drinking with one of the ranch hands. She heard his voice carrying from near the barn. "Worst deal of my life," James was saying. "I saved the ranch but lost my freedom. Should have just let the bank take it." The ranch hand laughed. "At least she can cook." "That's about all she's good for," James replied. Margaret's heart shattered. She stood up quickly and went inside, closing the door quietly. She didn't want him to know she had heard. That night, Margaret made a decision. She couldn't live like this. She couldn't stay where she wasn't wanted, where she was seen as a burden, a mistake, a bad deal. She began planning her escape. She had no money, no family who wanted her, nowhere to go, but she would figure something out. Anything was better than staying where she was hated. Margaret started saving small amounts of food. Hiding them in her room, she took inventory of her few possessions. She began asking subtle questions about the nearest town, about how far it was, what was there. She would leave, she decided. She would wait for the right moment, and then she would disappear. James noticed nothing. He continued his routine, unaware that his words had changed everything, unaware that the wife he ignored was planning to vanish from his life. The ranch continued operating. The house stayed clean. Meals appeared on time. On the surface, nothing had changed, but underneath, everything was different. Margaret had given up hope. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. Margaret had been married for exactly 6 weeks when everything changed. She had almost finished gathering supplies for her escape. Just a few more days, she told herself. Just a few more days, and she would leave this miserable place forever. But fate had different plans. It started on a cold October evening. James came in from working on the fence line. He looked exhausted, more tired than usual. His face was flushed, and he was sweating despite the cool weather. "Supper will be ready soon," Margaret said from the kitchen. James nodded and sat down heavily in his chair. He rubbed his forehead. "Are you all right?" Margaret asked. She tried to keep her voice neutral. She had learned not to show too much concern. "Fine," James muttered. "Just tired," but he wasn't fine. During supper, he barely ate. He kept shifting in his chair, uncomfortable. When he stood up to leave, he swayed slightly. "James?" Margaret said, "I'm going to sleep," he said. His voice sounded strange, thick. He walked toward the door, heading to the barn as always. But halfway across the room, his legs buckled. He grabbed the table to steady himself, but missed. James collapsed onto the floor with a heavy thud. Margaret rushed to him. "James! James, can you hear me?" His eyes were half open, but he seemed confused. His skin was burning hot. Margaret touched his forehead and pulled her hand back. He had a terrible fever. "Help me," James whispered. Can't breathe right?" Margaret's mind raced. She was angry at this man. She had planned to leave him, but she couldn't let him die on the floor. Whatever else she wasn't cruel. "I'm going to help you to bed," she said. "Can you stand?" James tried but couldn't. He was too weak. Margaret was strong from years of hard work, and she managed to get him to his feet. She half carried, half dragged him to the bedroom. It took all her strength to get him onto the bed. She pulled off his boots and covered him with blankets. He was shivering violently despite the fever. "Cold," James mumbled. "So cold." Margaret had seen this before. Years ago, pneumonia had swept through her town. Many people died, including her mother. She recognized the signs. High fever, chills, difficulty breathing. This was serious. The nearest doctor was in town. A 3-hour ride away, it was already dark. And she didn't know how to handle the horses well enough to make the trip at night. Besides, she couldn't leave James alone. Not like this. She would have to fight this illness herself. Margaret spent the entire night by James's bedside. She brought cold water and cloths, placing them on his forehead to bring down the fever. When he shivered, she added more blankets. When he burned up, she removed them. James drifted in and out of consciousness. Sometimes he seemed to know where he was. Other times he was lost in delirium. "Father," he called out once. "Father, I'm sorry. I tried to save it. I tried." "Shh," Margaret whispered. "Rest now." "The ranch," James mumbled. "Can't lose it." "Can't fail." Margaret wiped his face gently. "You won't fail," she said softly. "Just rest." As the night wore on, James got worse. His breathing became labored, raspy. He coughed violently. His whole body shaking, Margaret helped him sit up. Supporting his back, it seemed to help a little. "That's it," she encouraged. "Breathe slowly. You're going to be all right." But she wasn't sure he would be all right. People died from pneumonia all the time. Strong men, weak men, it didn't matter. The illness took whoever it wanted. Still, Margaret refused to give up. She had nowhere else to go, but more than that, she found she didn't want James to die. He had been cold to her, yes. He had said cruel things. But he had also given her shelter. He had never raised his hand to her. He had never forced himself on her. In his own way, he had been decent. Dawn came, and James was still breathing. His fever remained high, but he was alive. Margaret made strong broth from chicken and vegetables. She forced James to drink it, 1 spoonful at a time. He protested weakly, but she insisted. "You need strength," she said firmly. "Drink." The days blurred together. Margaret barely slept. She stayed by James's side constantly, changing his sweat-soaked sheets, giving him water, applying cold compresses, making him eat even when he didn't want to. The ranch hands came by, worried about their boss. "Should we fetch the doctor?" one asked. "No," Margaret said. "By the time he gets here, it might be too late." "I'll care for him." They looked doubtful. But they left her to it. On the 4th night, James's fever spiked dangerously high. He thrashed in the bed, completely delirious. "Mother!" he cried out. "Mother, don't leave me!" Margaret's heart broke. She remembered her own mother's death. The same illness, the same desperate moments. She climbed onto the bed beside James, something she had never done before. She cradled his head against her chest. "Holding him steady, I'm here," she whispered. "You're not alone." James calmed slightly at the sound of her voice. Margaret began singing. It was a lullaby her mother had sung to her long ago. She had almost forgotten the words, but they came back to her now, soft and gentle, in a language her grandmother had spoken. She sang through the night, holding James, keeping him warm, keeping him alive through sheer will. As dawn broke on the 5th day, something changed. James's breathing eased slightly. His fever seemed less intense. He opened his eyes. "And for the first time in days, they were clear, Margaret?" he whispered. His voice was hoarse. "I'm here," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You're going to be all right." "You stayed," James said, confused. "Why did you stay?" Margaret didn't know how to answer. She had planned to leave. She should hate him. But somewhere in these long nights, something had shifted. "Because you're my husband," she said simply. "And I don't abandon people." James closed his eyes again. But this time he was sleeping, not unconscious. It was peaceful, healing sleep. Margaret finally allowed herself to rest. She sat in the chair beside the bed and closed her eyes. She was exhausted. Every muscle in her body ached. But she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt needed. She felt purposeful. She felt like maybe, just maybe, she belonged somewhere after all. Over the next week, James slowly recovered. He was weak, but the worst had passed. Margaret continued caring for him, bringing him meals, helping him walk around the room to regain his strength. James watched her with different eyes now. This woman whom he had resented and ignored had saved his life. She could have let him die. She could have fled and left him to his fate. Instead, she had fought for him. Why? He asked her one afternoon, "Why what?" Margaret replied, "Why did you save me?" "I've been terrible to you." Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "Because everyone deserves a chance," she said finally. "Even people who make mistakes. Even people who say cruel things they don't mean." James felt shame wash over him. "I did mean them," he admitted. "At the time. But I was wrong." "I was so wrong about you." Margaret looked at him. "Surprised." "Thank you," James said, his voice breaking. "Thank you for my life." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even forgiveness. But it was a beginning, a real beginning. For the first time since their wedding day, they saw each other as human beings. Flawed, damaged, but trying, and sometimes that's all you need to start building something real. 2 weeks after his recovery, James was strong enough to return to light work around the ranch. Margaret insisted he take things slowly, and surprisingly, he listened to her. Something fundamental had changed between them. The wall of silence and resentment had begun to crack one evening. James didn't go to the barn after supper. Instead, he sat down in the chair by the fireplace. "Would you mind if I stayed inside tonight?" he asked awkwardly. "The barn gets cold." Margaret looked up from her mending. "This is your house," she said. "You don't need my permission." "It's your house, too," James replied. Those simple words meant more to Margaret than he could know. For the first time, someone had acknowledged that she belonged somewhere. "I'll make tea," she said. They sat together that evening, not speaking much. But the silence was different now. It wasn't hostile or uncomfortable. It was simply quiet. The fire crackled, the wind blew outside, and two people shared the same space without resentment. The next night, James stayed inside again. This time he brought a book. "Do you like reading?" Margaret asked. James shrugged. "I'm not very good at it," he admitted. "My father needed help on the ranch, so I didn't get much schooling." "I could read to you," Margaret offered. "If you'd like." James looked surprised. "You enjoy reading?" "Very much," Margaret said. "My father sent me to boarding school when I was young before—" She trailed off. "Before what?" James asked gently. Margaret hesitated. She had never told anyone this story. "Before his business failed," she said quietly. "We had money once. My mother came from a wealthy family. I went to a good school, learned literature, mathematics, music. Then my mother died giving birth to me, and my father's business collapsed soon after. He always blamed me for both." James felt something tighten in his chest. That wasn't your fault. He thought it was, Margaret said. He looked at me and saw everything he'd lost. The wife he loved, the life he had, he used to say I killed her. That I ate too much, cost too much, ruined too much. That's a terrible thing to say to a child, James said, anger rising in his voice. Margaret smiled sadly. I started to believe it. I thought maybe if I was smaller, prettier, better, he would love me. But nothing I did was ever enough. James was quiet for a moment. My father wasn't easy either, he said finally. He built this ranch from nothing. He was proud, strong. Everyone respected him when he died. I felt like I could never measure up, like I was always failing him, even in death. Is that why you couldn't let the ranch go? Margaret asked. Yes, James admitted. I thought if I lost it, I would be proving everyone right, that I wasn't good enough, that I was a failure. They looked at each other across the small room. Two people carrying shame and pain that wasn't really theirs to carry. We're quite a pair, Margaret said with a small laugh. James smiled. It was the first real smile Margaret had seen from him. Yes, he agreed, I suppose we are. From that night on, they developed a new routine after supper. Margaret would read aloud while James listened. They went through adventure stories, poetry, even agricultural journals that James found surprisingly interesting when Margaret explained the complicated parts. James began asking Margaret questions about things. Not just ranch business, but real questions. What was boarding school like? What's your favorite book? If you could go anywhere, where would it be? Margaret answered honestly. She told him about the friends she'd made at school before having to leave, about how she loved stories of faraway places, about her dream of seeing the ocean someday. In turn, James shared his own stories about growing up on the ranch, about his mother who had been kind and gentle, about the time he tried to break a wild horse and ended up with a broken arm. They laughed together. It was a strange, wonderful sound in the old house one afternoon. Margaret was working in the garden when James approached. I need to go into town for supplies, he said. Would you like to come? Margaret's heart sank. She remembered the last time they'd been in town. The stares, the whispers, the cruelty. I don't think that's a good idea, she said. Why not? James asked. You know why? Margaret said quietly. People talk. They laugh. James knelt down beside her in the dirt. Let them talk, he said. You're my wife. You have every right to go into town. They'll make fun of me, Margaret said. They'll make fun of you for being with me. I don't care what they think anymore, James said. And he meant it. Do you want to go or not? Margaret thought about it. She had been hiding at the ranch for weeks, avoiding the world, but she couldn't hide forever. Yes, she said, I'd like to go. The trip to town was easier than Margaret expected. People still stared, but James stayed by her side. When they entered the general store, he held the door open for her. When she looked at fabric, he asked her opinion. When Mrs. Henderson made a snide comment about some people eating well, James immediately ordered twice as many supplies as he needed. My wife is an excellent cook, he said loudly. She needs proper ingredients. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened, but she said nothing more. On the way home, Margaret felt lighter. Thank you, she said to James. For what? He asked. For treating me like I matter, she replied. James pulled the wagon to a stop. He turned to look at her directly. Margaret, he said seriously, you saved my life, you fixed my accounts. You made my house a home. You matter more than you know. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. I was wrong about you, James continued. I was wrong about everything. I thought this marriage was my punishment. But maybe, he hesitated, maybe it was actually my salvation. They sat in the wagon, looking at each other, really seeing each other for the first time. Something was growing between them. Something neither had expected. It wasn't love yet, but it was respect. It was friendship. It was the foundation of something that could become love. I'm glad you're here, James said quietly. I'm glad I stayed, Margaret replied. The sun was setting as they continued home, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Two people who had been strangers were becoming partners. Two people who had felt alone were finding companionship. It wasn't a fairy tale, There was no magic spell, no sudden transformation. Just two damaged people choosing to see the good in each other, choosing to build something instead of destroying it. As they pulled up to the ranch, Margaret looked at the house. Just weeks ago, she had seen it as a prison. Now it was starting to feel like home. James helped her down from the wagon. His hand lingered on hers for just a moment longer than necessary. Neither spoke about it, but both noticed. That night, James set up a proper bed for himself in the small side room. Not the barn, not the floor, but a real place in the house. They were still separate. But they were closer, small steps, Margaret thought as she lay in bed. But steps in the right direction. And for the first time since her wedding day, she allowed herself to hope. Spring arrived at the Whitaker Ranch, bringing new life to the land. The relationship between James and Margaret continued to grow slowly. Steadily, like the crops in the fields, they had become genuine friends, sharing meals, conversations, and comfortable silences. James found himself looking forward to coming inside each evening. Margaret's presence had transformed the lonely house into something warm. He caught himself smiling at her jokes, admiring her intelligence, appreciating the small ways she made his life better. Margaret felt the change, too. She no longer planned to leave. She no longer felt like an unwanted burden. When James looked at her now, she didn't see disgust or resentment. She saw something that looked almost like affection. But the world outside their ranch was not so kind. The town's annual spring festival was approaching. It was the biggest event of the year. Everyone attended. Ranchers, shopkeepers, families from miles around. There would be music, dancing, food competitions, and games. "We should go," James said one evening. Margaret's smile faded. "I don't think so." "Why not?" James asked, though he suspected the answer. "You know why," Margaret said. "Last time we were in town together. For the wedding, people were cruel. I don't want to go through that again." "That was months ago," James argued. "Things are different now, are they?" Margaret asked. "Have people changed? Or have we just been avoiding them?" James had no answer. She was right. They had kept to themselves, making only necessary trips to town. "Always quick, always careful. I want to take you," James said. "I want people to see us together. As a real married couple." Margaret felt her heart flutter. "Why?" she asked. James struggled to find the words. "Because you deserve to be seen," he said finally. "You deserve to be treated with respect. And if I keep hiding you away, I'm just as bad as everyone else." Margaret was touched by his words. But fear still gripped her. "They'll say terrible things." "Let them," James said. "I'll be with you." After much convincing, Margaret finally agreed. The day of the festival arrived bright and sunny. Margaret wore her best dress, though it was plain and simple. She had never owned fancy clothes. Even before her father lost his money, James wore his good suit and hat. He looked handsome, Margaret thought, then quickly pushed the thought away as they rode into town. Margaret's stomach churned with anxiety. She could already see the crowds gathered in the town square. Colorful banners hung between buildings. Tables were laden with food. Children ran around playing. Music drifted through the air. When they stepped down from the wagon, people began to notice them. The whispers started immediately. "Is that Margaret Walsh? Margaret Whitaker? Look how big she's gotten." "Can't believe they actually stayed married." James took Margaret's arm, linking it with his. "Hold your head up," he whispered. "You have nothing to be ashamed of." They walked into the festival together. James greeted people politely. Margaret smiled and nodded. Some people were cordial, others were openly rude. They found a spot to sit and watch the festivities. James brought Margaret lemonade and cake. He stayed close to her, attentive. "Look at him," someone said behind them, "playing the devoted husband. Wonder how much longer he can pretend." Margaret heard it. Her face burned with embarrassment. A group of women approached, led by Mrs. Henderson and two other prominent town ladies. Margaret recognized them all from her wedding day. "Margaret, dear," Mrs. Henderson said with false sweetness. "How nice to see you. How are you managing out at that ranch?" "Very well, thank you," Margaret replied quietly. "It must be so much work," another woman said. "All that cooking and cleaning." Must keep you quite busy, the third woman laughed. Well, she certainly hasn't missed any meals, the other women giggled. Margaret felt tears threatening, but she held them back. James stood up, his face dark with anger. That's enough, he said. Oh, we didn't mean anything by it, Mrs. Henderson said innocently. Just making conversation? No, James said firmly. You were being cruel and I won't tolerate it. My, Mrs. Henderson said, so defensive. One might think you actually care about her. I do care about her, James said, his voice rising. Margaret is intelligent, capable, and kind. She's the best thing that ever happened to me, and frankly, she's worth 10 of any of you. The women looked shocked. A crowd was beginning to gather. She saved my life when I was sick, James continued. She manages my household, my accounts, everything. She works harder than most men I know, and she does it all without complaint. James, please, Margaret whispered, mortified by the attention, but James wasn't finished. You all judge her because of how she looks, he said, addressing not just the women, but everyone watching. But you don't know her. You don't know what she's been through. You don't know how strong she is. She's still fat, someone in the crowd muttered. James spun around. Who said that? He demanded. Come forward and say it to my face. No one moved. That's what I thought, James said. You're all brave when you're whispering behind people's backs. But you're cowards when confronted, Billy. The ranch hand who had mocked them on their wedding day stepped forward. He was drunk. Everyone knows the truth, Whitaker, Billy slurred. You married her for money, you were desperate. You sold yourself to the highest bidder, or should I say the heaviest bidder. His friends roared with laughter. James's fist connected with Billy's jaw before anyone could react. Billy fell backward into the dirt, blood trickling from his split lip. Anyone else want to insult my wife? James asked dangerously. The crowd went silent. Margaret stood up, shaking. James, let's go, she said, her voice breaking. Please, let's just go. James looked at her and saw tears streaming down her face. His anger deflated immediately. Yes, he said. We're leaving. They walked back to the wagon in silence. People parted to let them through. No one said a word, but Margaret could feel their eyes on her. Judging, mocking, pitying. As soon as they were out of town, Margaret broke down completely. She sobbed, her whole body shaking. All the pain, all the shame, all the years of cruelty came pouring out. James stopped the wagon. He didn't know what to do. He had never seen her cry like this. I'm sorry, Margaret gasped between sobs. I'm so sorry. What are you sorry for? James asked. For being like this, Margaret cried. For embarrassing you, for making you defend me, for existing. Stop, James said firmly. He moved closer to her on the wagon seat. Margaret, look at me. She couldn't. She covered her face with her hands. Please, James said gently. Finally, Margaret lowered her hands. Her face was red and swollen from crying. You have nothing to apologize for, James said. Those people are ignorant and cruel. Their opinions mean nothing, but they're right, Margaret said. I am fat, I am ugly, you did marry me for money. This whole marriage is a lie. It started as a business arrangement, James admitted. But it's not a lie anymore. Not to me. Margaret looked at him through her tears. Over these past months, James said, you've become important to me. I look forward to seeing you every day. I value your opinions, I respect your mind. He hesitated. I care about you, genuinely. You don't have to say that, Margaret whispered. I'm saying it because it's true, James insisted. I was an idiot when we first married. I was so focused on my own problems that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. A remarkable woman who deserved better than what I gave her, James, Margaret said softly. I don't know what this is between us, James continued. But I know it's real. And I know that those people back there don't matter. Only we matter. Margaret searched his face, looking for deception, looking for pity, but all she saw was sincerity. I care about you too, she admitted. More than I should. More than I meant to. They sat there on the wagon looking at each other. The walls between them finally crumbling completely. James reached out and gently wiped a tear from Margaret's cheek. The touch was electric. Something was shifting. Something bigger than friendship. Something that felt like the beginning of love. The ride home from the festival was quiet. but it was a different kind of quiet. James and Margaret sat close together on the wagon seat, closer than necessary. Neither spoke about what had happened, about what had been said, but both felt it hanging in the air between them, something fragile and new. When they arrived at the ranch, the sun was setting. The sky was painted in shades of pink and purple. James helped Margaret down from the wagon, and his hands lingered on her waist just a moment longer than needed. "Thank you," Margaret said softly, "for defending me." "I meant every word," James replied, looking into her eyes. They stood there, neither wanting to break the moment. Finally, Margaret turned and walked into the house. James watched her go, his heart pounding in a way it never had before. Over the next few days, something shifted between them. The comfortable friendship they had built was transforming into something deeper. James found himself noticing small things about Margaret, the way she hummed while cooking, the way she bit her lip when concentrating on the account books, the way her eyes lit up when she laughed. He started looking for excuses to be near her, to brush past her in the kitchen, to sit closer by the fire in the evenings, to make her smile. Margaret noticed the changes, too. She caught James watching her sometimes, his gaze soft and thoughtful. When their hands accidentally touched, neither pulled away quickly anymore. The air between them felt charged, electric with possibility. One evening, about a week after the festival, James came in carrying wildflowers. "I found these by the creek," he said, almost shy. "Thought you might like them." Margaret's breath caught. No one had ever given her flowers before. "They're beautiful," so she said, taking them carefully. "Thank you." She put them in a jar of water and placed them on the kitchen table. All through supper, she kept glancing at them, smiling. After they ate, they sat by the fire as usual. Margaret began to read, but James interrupted her. "Would you rather talk tonight?" he asked. "Of course," Margaret said, setting the book aside. "What would you like to talk about?" James was quiet for a moment, gathering courage. "Do you remember when you asked me why I couldn't let the ranch go?" he began. "Yes," Margaret said. "I've been thinking about that," James continued. "About how I was so focused on not failing, on proving myself, that I couldn't see what really mattered." He paused. "I almost lost something much more valuable than land." "What do you mean?" Margaret asked, though her heart was racing. "You," James said simply. "I almost lost you. When you were planning to leave, I didn't even notice. I was so wrapped up in my own bitterness." Margaret's eyes widened. "How did? You know I was planning to leave?" "I found the food you'd hidden," James admitted. "The supplies in your room, I found them when you were in the garden one day. I realized what you were doing, and it terrified me." "Why didn't you say anything?" Margaret asked. "Because I thought I deserved it," James said. "I thought you had every right to go, and then I got sick, and you stayed. You saved me when you could have just walked away." "I couldn't leave you to die," Margaret said. "But you could have," James pointed out. "Most people would have, after how I treated you, but you didn't. That's when I started to understand who you really are." Margaret felt tears forming in her eyes. "You're brave," James continued. "You're strong. You're kind even when the world has been cruel to you. You're everything I'm not." "That's not true," Margaret protested. "Let me finish," James said gently. "I've spent these past months getting to know you, really know you, and somewhere along the way, something happened." He took a deep breath. "I fell in love with you." "Margaret!" The words hung in the air. Margaret stared at him, unable to believe what she'd heard. "You don't mean that," she whispered. "I do," James said, moving closer. "I love you. Not out of obligation, not out of gratitude. I love you because of who you are. Because you make me laugh. Because you challenge me. Because you see the world in ways I never could. Because when I wake up in the morning, the first thing I want is to see your face." Tears rolled down Margaret's cheeks. I'm afraid, she admitted. Of what? James asked. That this isn't real, Margaret said. That you'll wake up one day and realize you made a mistake, that I'm still just the fat girl no one wanted. James reached out and took her hands. Look at me, he said. Margaret lifted her tear-filled eyes to his. You are beautiful, James said. Not despite anything, just beautiful. Your mind, your heart, your soul, and yes, your face, your smile, everything about you. James, Margaret breathed. I know I hurt you, James said. I know I have to earn your trust, but if you'll let me, I want to spend the rest of my life loving you, really loving you, the way you deserve to be loved. Margaret's heart felt like it might burst. I love you too, she confessed. I've tried not to. I've tried to protect myself, but I can't help it. I love you. James smiled, a genuine, joyful smile. May I kiss you? He asked. A real kiss? Not like at the wedding? Margaret nodded, unable to speak. James cupped her face gently in his hands. He looked into her eyes for a long moment. Then slowly, carefully, he kissed her. It was soft and sweet and full of promise. It was nothing like their awkward wedding kiss. This was real. This was love. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathless. Stay with me tonight, James whispered. Not in separate rooms as husband and wife. Really married? Margaret's heart raced, but she nodded. Yes, she said. That night, James and Margaret truly became one. They loved each other tenderly, carefully, discovering each other without shame or hesitation. Margaret had spent years believing no one could desire her, but James showed her differently. He worshipped every part of her, making her feel precious and wanted. Afterward, they lay together in the darkness, Margaret's head on James's chest, his arms around her. I never thought I could be this happy, Margaret said softly. Neither did I, James replied, kissing the top of her head. What changed? Margaret asked. When did you start to love me? James thought about it. I don't think it was one moment, he said. It was all the small moments, every conversation, every shared meal, every smile. They added up until one day I realized I couldn't imagine my life without you. I feel the same way, Margaret said. They fell asleep in each other's arms. Two people who had been forced together by desperation had found something neither expected. True love. The ranch that James had fought so hard to save suddenly didn't seem as important. It was just land, just wood and dirt. What mattered was the woman beside him, the life they were building together, and Margaret, who had spent her whole life feeling unwanted and unloved, finally understood what it meant to belong to someone, not as property, not as an obligation, but as a cherished partner, an equal, a beloved wife. Outside, the stars shone brightly over the Whitaker Ranch. Inside, two hearts beat as one. And for the first time in their lives, both James and Margaret felt complete. Love had found them in the most unexpected way, and it would carry them through whatever challenges lay ahead. 1 year had passed since that night when everything changed. The Whitaker Ranch had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The land that James had desperately fought to save was now thriving beyond anything his father had achieved. The difference was Margaret. Her sharp mind for business and James's dedication to hard work created a powerful combination. She reorganized everything, breeding schedules, crop rotations, supply orders, market timing. Under her management, expenses dropped and profits soared. But the accounts were just numbers. The real change was in the partnership. James consulted Margaret on every decision. They worked side by side, planning, discussing, building their future together. The ranch hands noticed the difference, too. The boss was happier, more focused. The whole operation ran smoother. More importantly, James and Margaret were deeply, genuinely happy. Their love had grown stronger with each passing day. They laughed together, worked together, dreamed together. The house that had once been cold and empty was now filled with warmth and life. One morning, Margaret stood in front of the mirror. She barely recognized herself, not because of any dramatic physical change, but because of the confidence in her eyes. The woman looking back at her stood tall, smiled easily, radiated contentment. She had changed physically, too. The constant physical work on the ranch, riding horses, tending the large garden, hauling water had transformed her body naturally. She had lost a significant amount of weight over the year. Her clothes fit differently, her movements were easier. But Margaret knew the real transformation was internal. She no longer defined herself by her father's cruelty or society's judgment. She was valued, loved, essential. That changed everything. James walked up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, kissing her neck. Margaret smiled. She believed him now when he called her beautiful. "Good morning, husband. Ready to go into town?" James asked. Margaret had been avoiding town since the festival incident. But today was different. Today they had business to conduct, real business. They had become the most successful ranch in the county. People who had mocked them now wanted to do business with them. The same banker who had threatened to foreclose now courted their accounts. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. When they rode into town, people stared again, but this time, the stares were different. There was surprise, curiosity, even respect. "Is that Margaret Whitaker?" someone whispered. "She looks so different." "They say the Whitaker Ranch is the most profitable in 3 counties. I heard she's the brains behind it all." James and Margaret walked through town with confidence. They stopped at the bank first. Mr. Thornton, the banker, greeted them with exaggerated enthusiasm. "Mr. Whitaker, Mrs. Whitaker, such a pleasure," he gushed. "I've been hoping to speak with you about expansion opportunities." "We're not interested in loans," Margaret said coolly. "We're here to make a deposit." She handed him a bank book. His eyes widened when he saw the amount. "This is quite substantial," he stammered. "Yes," Margaret said. "We believe in financial security, unlike some people who threatened foreclosure at the first sign of trouble, Mr." Thornton had the decency to look embarrassed. As they left the bank, they encountered Mrs. Henderson outside her general store. "Margaret, dear," she called out, her voice syrupy sweet. "You look wonderful. You simply must tell me your secret." Margaret looked at the woman who had been so cruel to her. "Hard work," she said simply. "And being surrounded by people who actually care about me, Mrs." Henderson's smile faltered. They continued through town, conducting their business with dignity. Some people tried to befriend them now, suddenly interested in the successful couple. James and Margaret were polite but distant. They remembered who had shown kindness and who hadn't. The biggest surprise came when they returned to the ranch that afternoon. A familiar wagon was parked in front of the house. Cornelius Walsh had returned. Margaret's father stood by his wagon, looking older and more worn than she remembered. When he saw them approach, something flickered across his face. "Shock, perhaps, Margaret," he said uncertainly. "Is that you?" "Hello, Father," Margaret said, her voice steady. Cornelius looked between Margaret and James, clearly confused by what he was seeing. I heard the ranch was doing well. I thought perhaps you thought you could get more money," James finished coldly. Cornelius had the grace to look ashamed. "Business has been difficult," he said. "I thought maybe we could help each other again." "Help each other?" Margaret repeated, her voice rising. "You sold me, Father. You took money to get rid of me. You abandoned me at my own wedding. You told me to be grateful someone was willing to take me." "I was doing what was best," Cornelius protested weakly. "Best for whom?" Margaret demanded. "You were ashamed of me my entire life. You blamed me for Mother's death. You made me believe I was worthless." "Margaret." Cornelius started. "No," she interrupted. "You don't get to explain. You don't get to make excuses. What you did was cruel. You treated me like I was a burden to be discarded." James put his hand on Margaret's shoulder, supporting her. "But I want to thank you," Margaret continued, surprising everyone, including herself. "Because you forced me into this marriage. You inadvertently gave me the greatest gift of my life." She turned to James, who looked at her with such love it made her heart ache. "I found a real home," Margaret said. "I found someone who values me, respects me, loves me for exactly who I am. I found happiness I never thought possible. She turned back to her father. You thought you were getting rid of a problem? But you were giving me a chance at a real life. Cornelius looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw what he had missed all those years. A strong, capable, beautiful woman who had thrived despite his cruelty. Not because of his guidance, I was wrong, he said finally, his voice breaking. About everything. About you? Yes, you were, Margaret agreed. And it's too late now. You're not part of my life anymore. You made that choice, Margaret, Cornelius pleaded. You need to leave, James said firmly. You're not welcome here. Cornelius looked like he wanted to argue, but something in James's expression stopped him. He climbed back into his wagon. I am proud of you, he said to Margaret. For what it's worth nothing, Margaret replied. Goodbye, Father. They watched him drive away. Margaret felt James's arm around her. Are you all right? He asked. Yes, Margaret said, and she meant it. I'm free. That evening, they sat on their porch watching the sunset. Margaret leaned against James, content. Do you ever regret it? She asked. That desperate arrangement that brought us together? James thought about it. I regret how it started, he said honestly. I regret how I treated you at first, but regret marrying you? Never. You're the best thing that ever happened to me, even though I'm still the same person he tried to get rid of, Margaret asked. You're not the same person, James said. You've grown, changed, blossomed, but even if you were exactly the same, I would still love you because I see you, the real you. And she's extraordinary, Margaret smiled. We should start that school we talked about, she said. They had discussed opening a small school on their property. Margaret wanted to teach children from families who couldn't afford education, especially girls who were told they weren't smart enough or didn't matter. We'll start next month, James agreed. You'll be an excellent teacher. As darkness fell, they remained on the porch. Two people who had been brought together by desperation, greed, and circumstance. Two people who had every reason to fail. But they hadn't failed. They had built something beautiful. A marriage based on mutual respect, genuine love, and true partnership. The town had expected disaster. They had bet on failure. Instead, they witnessed a love story that would be told for generations. The forced marriage had become the greatest love either had ever known. And the transformation, the real transformation, wasn't in weight lost or money gained. It was in two broken people healing each other, in two lonely souls finding home. In two hearts learning that love doesn't require perfection, just genuine connection. James and Margaret Whitaker had proven that sometimes the most unexpected beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings, and their story was just beginning.